I'm Jess, this is Greg, and this is our shuttle bus. Before we bought this bus, we lived full-time in a 1995 GMC Vandera box van that was converted into an RV. We traveled all over the country in it. We went to over, I believe, 25 states by the time we were done, and we very recently sold it in order to purchase this bus, which is going to be our next home.
The bus itself is a Thomas CL100 built on a Ford E450 chassis, and it has the 7.3 Power Stroke turbo diesel engine in it. Before we bought it, it was a prison transport vehicle, and it had all sorts of cages and bars and all sorts of prison-like accoutrement in the entire interior.
We purchased the bus in Arizona while we were on the road with our old van, still living in it full time. So we actually had our empty bus and our old van together at a camp spot out in the desert outside of Phoenix for a short while we facilitated the sale of the van. So we moved all of our stuff out of our old van while we were selling it, taking pictures and setting it up for the sale, into our empty bus, and then drove both vehicles to Georgia, where the van is now being kept. From there, we drove our bus back up to New York, where Greg and I are from, which is where we'll be completing the conversion on the bus this summer.
How's your new mansion feel?
Look at the size of this thing. I got this is so much space. It looks good.
I think we're pretty much halfway there with the build.
I think we're done. I think we're gonna throw a bed in the back and we're gonna call it a day.
Sounds good.
As soon as we made it back to New York, we wasted no time tearing things out. All of the metal, all of the bars, all of the diamond plate. I think we drilled probably 5 million rivets out to take out all of the aluminum on the sides of the walls and on the ceiling.
One of the biggest question marks when you buy a bus specifically to convert it is the condition of your floor. A lot of people buy a bus that looks like it's in good shape, and then they tear out their internal structures and find that their floor is completely rusted through or destroyed in a number of ways and has to be completely rebuilt. This bus is a 2003, so you would think on an 18-year-old vehicle you would probably find some rust, but because this bus lived almost its entire life in Arizona, there is almost zero rust on the frame of this bus, which is very exciting. What that allowed us to do was to start building a lot quicker than a lot of other people get the chance to do, since we had no major structural repairs to do. We had a couple of beams on the interior, one specifically over here, that had some rust damage from the windows leaking, which Greg welded in a new support beam for that. But after we had that repair done, we were able to start on the subfloor right away. There are a lot of schools of thought when it comes to putting in insulation and a subfloor into a bus build. We decided to go with foam board for our insulation. It's really cheap and it's readily available. And then we used 1x2s as floor supports underneath the structure that would become our actual subfloor. We constructed the subfloor, which you can see, that's the floor that's visible now, out of 1/2-inch thick plywood. We made a whole template of the floor of the bus, rolled it out onto the plywood, traced it, and then framed everything outside, and then dropped all the pieces into place over the course of one day, it's always fun to complete an entire job in just, an afternoon into an evening.
As I mentioned before, these windows did leak when we bought the bus. Replacing the seals and everything in these windows was something we knew we would have to do as soon as we got this thing, and it was something we were kind of dreading because we've heard horror stories about taking windows out and them not fitting properly when they go back in, and all sorts of headaches that come with replacing the seals on these windows. We opted to work on each window one at a time as a means to hopefully keep the opening of the window still in its place, instead of removing all the windows at once and having things shift. We thought that this would be a good way to keep everything where it is. We started by removing the window taking off the old gaskets that had been so compressed over the years and replacing them with new ones. At some point, someone had sealed around these windows with caulk, and it had hardened significantly over the years, which made this terrible job just all that much more terrible, having to scrape off all of that excess caulk. After that was done, we laid a layer of butyl tape around the opening of the window, pressed the window back into place, put the frame back up, screwed it back in, and we just repeated that process about 14 times.
After we finished sealing the windows, the next thing we did was paint all of the exposed metal inside the bus with a rust-preventing paint. We used Rust-Oleum Heavy Rust Primer because we didn't see the need to put any sort of top coat on it because it's going to be all covered up by the structures we build inside the bus. But it was probably a good, safe thing to do to prevent any future water from getting in here and causing problems to the structure. So after we finished painting everything, the next thing we wanted to move on to was putting up the wall supports, the burring strips. It's 1x2s screwed directly into the metal supports of the bus, running underneath and above the windows and down the floor in some places. And then in between those supports, we're putting more foam board as insulation. So we actually have 2 layers of insulation on the walls, and there will be 2 layers on the ceiling as well, because we're leaving the bus's factory insulation in place.
After we got all of our furring strips up on the walls and laid all of the insulation, we moved on to installing our water heater. We opted to go with a tankless on-demand propane hot water heater. This was the first luxury item that we bought for the bus. It's not exactly the cheapest way to run hot water for a bus build, but it does allow you to have unlimited access to hot water, which is something we were super excited about. When we first lived in our van, we had no hot water at all. So to have unlimited hot water that doesn't use any electricity, seeing as it runs on propane, was something that we were super excited to purchase and get installed. The first step in installing the water heater was to cut a hole in the side of the bus. These water heaters vent outside, so they need to face literally the outside of the vehicle. We cut about a 15 by 15 inch hole, which was a very scary moment. Anybody who's ever built anything in a vehicle or installed anything knows that one of the scariest things you can do when you're building is cut holes anywhere on the vehicle that they shouldn't be. Fortunately, we measured correctly and the water heater fit into the hole. We then framed out the hole with 2x4s for added support so that the water heater doesn't go bouncing around and shifting as we drive down the road. After we had our water heater installed, we moved on to constructing our propane locker. There are 2 main options that people tend to go with when it comes to having propane in their build. There's the undermount propane tank, which involves actually mounting a propane tank underneath your build. And then there is the propane locker route, which we decided to go with. We decided to go with the propane locker mainly because, one, we couldn't really find any undermount propane tanks. At the moment, for whatever reason, every online store is sold out of them. And honestly, we didn't really have the clearance we were comfortable with for mounting one underneath. We were afraid that if we went down a really rocky, hilly road, potentially something could scrape, and that's kind of a dangerous thing.
Our propane locker is constructed of plywood and silicone sealant primarily. It's really important when you travel with this much propane to make sure that the propane locker is completely isolated from the living space in the event of a leak. So we sealed all of the seams inside and outside of the locker with a generous amount of silicone sealant in order to make sure that no propane will ever enter the living space should any propane leak out of our propane canisters. The locker is also vented through the floor because propane is heavier than air. So if something were to leak, the propane would exit the bus through the floor and not leak into the living space instead. The propane locker can hold 3 20-pound propane tanks, 2 that will be in service and 1 that will be used as a backup tank should one of our main tanks run out of fuel. These are the kind of tanks you would see on a gas grill or a barbecue and are available in a lot more places than regular propane fills for RVs can be found. So that kind of brings us up to speed on where we are with the bus right now.
In the coming weeks, we're hoping to get started on our solar, run some plumbing, run our electric, maybe put some furniture in here that isn't just folding chairs from the garage.
We're looking forward to making a lot more progress in the near future, and we want to thank you for following along with us. We will see you soon.